Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, South Carolina, finishing up winter workouts in the early portion of spring practice. And if you are a South Carolina fan, you are hearing all the right things coming out of this program during the early portions of spring practice. Now, look, it's early. Really, the only news that we're going to get is positive. But if you're a South Carolina fan, you're getting the positive news at the positions that you wanted to hear some positive news from. Now, I think the two things that stand out to me early on for South Carolina in spring practice, the transfer portal additions that South Carolina made in the winter months, it sounds like there's a lot of hits within that group, meaning some of the new faces that we are seeing come into the South Carolina program are going to be difference makers for South Carolina in the 2025 season. That's obviously some really good news. And I think secondly, and this is probably the driving force in terms of my optimism around this program. The national media, they'll talk about LaNorris Sellers. We've talked extensively about LaNorris Sellers as well. The other aspect about the South Carolina team that really has me believing in 2025 is they look like a top end team along the line of scrimmage, specifically on the offensive line. And the South Carolina fans know this just about as much as anybody, that if you want to win in this conference, you have to look like teams like Georgia, like Alabama, along the lines of scrimmage. And from what we're hearing early on about this South Carolina offensive line, not only is it really big, it's really physical, it's really deep, but this is a unit that's coming together potentially in a big time way heading into 2025. Yes, the national media narrative around South Carolina will start with LaNorris Sellers. He is the engine of this offense, really the engine of this football team. Do not sleep on what this offensive line can be for South Carolina in 2025 and coming out of spring or kind of the early portions of spring practice. You're hearing all the right things about that unit up front. And that just is it kind of just more fuel to the fire in terms of believing in the South Carolina team going into 2025. Now, I want to get into some specific names that have stood out in winter workouts and in the early portions of spring practice. Before we get into it, as always, to the South Carolina fans, appreciate you guys. It really has been a blast talking this program over the last couple of months. All the support y'all have shown the fellas and the dead of spring, dead of winter months has been amazing. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Heck of a lot to talk about regarding this South Carolina team over the next couple of weeks and months. Without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start with one of the biggest names on this South Carolina team, and that is running back Rahsul Faison coming over from Utah State. Now, we are still waiting on the final word of his eligibility in 2025. Shane Beamer continues to be very optimistic about the news that they're going to hear from the NCAA. Now, a quick side note there, it's ridiculous that the NCAA has not given this kid final word on his eligibility. Like, this is a guy that would be going to the NFL draft. He would be participating in the combine, participating in pro days, and being selected in the NFL draft. And him not knowing his eligibility, I didn't need many other reasons to really be frustrated with the NCAA. Here's just another reason for you. Now, put the eligibility question mark aside. This kid has transformed his body. And you can say that for a lot of members of the South Carolina team. You talk about the strength and conditioning aspect of this program, and we saw what they did during the pro day and what they did during the combine, or I should say what they did during the combine mostly. They are developing these kids physically at a very high level. And Rahsul Faison, probably the best example of that. He's up to 220 pounds. You see the spring practice pictures of this kid. He looks the part of an elite SEC running back. And we talked about the offensive line and how optimistic I am about the offensive line. Now you have what I think could be one of the best running backs, not only in the conference, but in the country. It's exactly what you're looking to do, because you look at LaNorris Sellers and what he can provide from a running aspect in the South Carolina offense. Then you combine that with Rahsul Faison. This is going to be a South Carolina team that, if Rahsul Faison is eligible in 2025 and the offensive line is as good as I think it can be, it's going to be one of the better rushing attacks that you see in all the country. Now, why is that so important? Because we know LaNorris Sellers loves working play action, and he loves pushing the ball down the field. If you can really have that consistent rushing attack that kind of South Carolina found at the end of 2024, and we all saw what that meant for that offense. This offense is going to be really, really good because LaNorris Sellers can push the ball down the field. You got a ton of wide receivers who are really big, really fast, can work vertically down the field. This is an offense with an elite rushing attack is going to be extremely difficult for a lot of defenses to deal with because you got to pick and choose. If you want to give South Carolina a light box with LaNorris Sellers at quarterback, with Rahsul Faison in this offensive line, they're going to run right all over you. If you want to start loading the box and spinning a safety down into the box, well, you got guys like Nick Harbor who can stretch the field just about as good as anybody in the country. The emergence of Rahsul Faison not only being a good running back for South Carolina, but what sounds like he could be a great running back for South Carolina, that should excite a lot of South Carolina fans. Number two, linebacker, linebacker position, Fred Johnson. You're talking 6'4", he's up to 240 pounds, 4'5" in the 40-yard dash. The one thing that stands out to me about South Carolina's linebacker room is, look, I get we got question marks about the experience of this unit. You lost a lot of guys that played a lot of football. The upside that they have from physical trait standpoint, Fred Johnson, Justin O. You could even throw in Sean Murphy, who was a very good athlete coming out of high school. The potential of this unit is certainly there. And I think sometimes, and we've had this conversation with South Carolina, we kind of gravitate towards that returning production metric and kind of forget that, hey, sometimes you got guys who are coming up in this program that can be just as good, if not better. I don't think it's crazy to have that conversation. And it's not a shot at guys like a Demetrius Knight last year or like a Bam Martin Scott. Those guys were very, very good. But you got a ton of talent in this linebacker room that sounds like they might be taking that step. And, Fred Johnson to me kind of reminds you of Pup Howard. Where Pup Howard, when he played as a true freshman for South Carolina in the 2023 year, he looked the part immediately. Same thing with Fred Johnson. You see this freshman taking the field, he don't look like no freshman. Now, between the years, Pup Howard and Fred Johnson definitely look like freshmen. Well, Pup Howard going into year 2 at Florida was awesome for the Florida Gators. You're kind of hoping for the same track record of development with a guy like Fred Johnson going into year 2. The speed and athleticism of this unit is just so far and away better than what it was in 2023. I mean, you remember 2 years ago, guys like Stone Blanton, South Carolina was stuck in the mud at the linebacker position. I mean, teams were saying, hey, you don't have the linebackers to run and chase and deal with us in space. We're going to attack you. It's not the case with South Carolina at the linebacker position. And although you don't have a ton of experience in that room, it's a really talented room. And it's a room that could be a lot better than most people expect going into 2025. Next one on the list, Gabriel Brown-Ladindi. Now, we haven't heard anything extremely positive about him, but what we have heard is he's healthy. And that is really the first time in this kid's career that he's been healthy for a full offseason. You go back to his time at Texas A&M, he tore his ACL right before he started his career at Texas A&M, then dealt with some other injuries during seemingly every single offseason since. What does Gabriel Brown-Ladindi look like for healthy, like as a healthy guy for 12 months in a full offseason going into 2025? This is one of those guys that, he has not played a ton, very similar to how we talk about Fred Johnson. Hasn't played a ton at Texas A&M over the last couple of years, could be one of the better defensive linemen for the South Carolina football team in 2025. And that's obviously a concern that we have for South Carolina. How do you replace a guy like Alex Huntley, TJ Sanders, Tonka Hemingway? You might have one with Gabriel Brown-Ladindi, and you're hearing very similar good things about Devontae Miles coming from Bowling Green. And Devontae Miles doesn't have the upside that Gabriel Brown-Ladindi has. But as a rotational piece, you're hearing the things we want to hear about the middle of this defensive line. Still might be a position that South Carolina wants to address in the transfer portal, but let's kind of wait and see how spring practice goes for some of these new faces on this defensive line. Another new face that's standing out, Brandon Sissy. Now, we knew he was a really good football player, and I think what stands out to me the most is the versatility. Similar to how we talk about Jalen Kilgore. Jalen Kilgore could play nickel, could play safety. Brandon Sissy could play nickel, could play boundary corner. And so you talk about all right, how do we get our best 5 defensive backs on the football field at the same time when you have players who are really good, like Brandon Sissy, like Jalen Kilgore, that you can kind of mix and match to get your best 5 players on the field? It's really good. You go with Brandon Sissy, I love him at nickel. He's a guy that only missed 3% of his tackles in the 2024 season. It's what you're looking for from a nickel cornerback that needs to be able to get involved in the run game. Another name to monitor, Cam Pringle, not a new face, but a guy that we all remember him coming out of high school. Cam Pringle, the thing with Cam Pringle is kind of the opposite of what Josiah Thompson had to do, right? Josiah Thompson came in to South Carolina and had to put on weight. So, hey, if you want to play as a true freshman, you got to add some weight, add some physicality. Cam Pringle's kind of the opposite. You know, when he came into South Carolina, he had the size and physicality, but we needed to shed some of the bad weight and kind of change the body up a little bit. Well, it sounds like that's happened with South Carolina over the last 12 months, and he's getting a look at guard. This is another one of those, hey, South Carolina's trying to figure out how do we get our best 5 offensive linemen on the football field. Josiah Thompson ain't going anywhere at left tackle. We really liked what we saw from Case and Henry towards the down stretch of 2024. Well, you got guys like Cam Pringle and Tree Babalade who are probably should be having a chance to play for South Carolina on the offensive line. All right, well, let's kick them into guard. Let's see what they can do. And very similar to our discussion around Shree, and Cam Pringle might be a better guard than he is tackle because this dude is overwhelming with his size and physicality, very similar to a guy like Tree. This is what I mean by South Carolina starting to look like top-end teams in the SEC along the line of scrimmage. This is a big offensive line, and it's a really deep offensive line. I mean, you pull up the depth chart really quick. I mean, you feel good about Trevon Baugh. You feel good about Marquis Anderson. Those are guys that might be in the 3 deep for the South Carolina offensive line. It's not only the most talented offensive line that South Carolina has had. To me, it might be it's for sure the deepest offensive line as well. Now, the last player I want to mention is Jalen Brown. Didn't play a ton for Missouri his freshman year. He's like that heavy-handed edge that really could complement a guy like Dylan Stewart. Now, Dylan Stewart made some massive strides in terms of his ability to stop the run as a true freshman, but was always a better pass rusher than he was stopping the run. Well, Jalen Brown on the other side, I think he's all the traits to be a really good pass rusher, but he's going to be a hammer against the run. I mean, at 6'5", 265, there's not many edge defenders that are better at the point of attack than Jalen Brown. The body seems to be where it needs to be. You're starting to hear some positive returns about him. And that conversation about, hey, how do we replace a guy like Kyle Kennard? Well, it starts with Dylan Stewart. Well, Jalen Brown seems to be another guy that certainly could start on the opposite side of a guy like Dylan Stewart. And then you look from the depth standpoint and say, all right, well, we feel good about Brian Thomas. Feel pretty good about Desmond Yu going into year 3. I look at this South Carolina team, and the things that stand out are, one, the new faces that are trying to address some pretty big question marks on the South Carolina team are starting to stand out. And then secondly, this is just such a deep team. And South Carolina has bet on traits on the recruiting trail for the last couple of years. And it sounds like these traits that we're betting on, they're starting to show themselves going into 2025. You're hearing all the right things. And again, this is not the time where we're going to hear a ton of bad news, but you're hearing the good news at the positions that you want to hear good news from. And I think that's probably the thing that stands out to me the most. We will sign out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.